Yeah. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Patrick Paul Walsh. I'm president of the society, and it's very much looking forward to this symposium on financing sustainable development in Ireland. But I'm going to first ask the secretary to read the meetings of the last meeting, and then we'll proceed with the three presentations.
Okay, you're all very welcome. Minutes of the fourth ordinary meeting of the 176th session of the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland. This was held at 5:30 p.m. on Thursday, 23rd of March, 2023, online and at the Merrion room of the RDS. Society President Paul Walsh was in the chair for the presentation of a paper entitled An Analysis of the Current Leaving Certificate Point System and a New Leaving Certificate Point System by Danny O'Hare, President Emeritus DCU, and Michael Ryan, Professor Emeritus of Computing DCU. Aidan Doris and Paul Devereux proposed a vote of thanks. There were other contributions from the floor, including from Donald de Butler, Paul Walsh, amongst others. Following the discussion and responses from the authors, the President thanked those who had contributed and brought the meeting to a close. I'll pass you over to Paul now to introduce speakers.
So thank you everyone for attending online and in person. So without further ado, I think it's 20 minutes, all right? Is that what you have planned? Yeah, great. So we'll have our first speaker, Yvonne McCarthy, head of the climate change unit in the Central Bank of Ireland, and she is going to make a presentation on financing sustainable development. So we'll get your slides up here.
Good evening, everyone, and online also. I can't see anyone online, but I'm sure people are there. But thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you this evening. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about sustainable development, and indeed, it's very closely interlinked with my own work area, which is climate change at the moment. So I'm very excited to talk to you here today. And indeed, while the time is limited in terms of presentation, very happy to pick up conversation with any of you afterwards, whether it's here today or indeed via email or anything like that. So please don't be shy. So I suppose when we think about what I'm going to talk about today, I'm taking advantage of being the first speaker up here today to essentially use my time to sort of set the scene a little bit, also for the presentations that are going to follow. I just really want to talk about why, the reality of climate change as we know it today and why sustainability has to be a priority. I want to tell you a little bit then about the role of the central bank and indeed the financial system in terms of transitioning the world to a more climate neutral space. So firstly, just to take a little bit of a step back and we think a little bit about, what's the reality of climate change? Well, we're all no doubt acutely aware of the very stark findings in relation to climate change in recent years. Every year, there's a new climate record broken in terms of the metrics that are recorded, and things are getting progressively worse and worse every year. And this chart, it's a slide, it's a different way of depicting the climate problem, and it's just essentially showing us what the temperature increases in the globe have been since about 1850, which is on the left-hand side, that's represented by the blue bars on the left-hand side, to the right-hand side of the chart, and the red that you see there. So essentially the key takeaway is that climate change is a very big problem. Temperatures have been increasing consistently now on an annual basis globally for the last number of years. And indeed, the concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere have also been progressively getting worse. And this picture looks very similar if you're to look at this from a European perspective or indeed from an Irish perspective. And what does it mean in terms of where we're going for the future? Are things going to get any better? Well, unfortunately, the picture isn't looking great. What we've got here is the projections from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So they do all the modeling around what the future looks like in terms of climate change and temperature changes and the like. And essentially what we've got is the green line is just the historical temperature changes since 1950. Best case scenario, the lowest blue line there, is basically saying if the world, performs really well in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, if we do everything we need to do to meet all our climate targets, we have, some chance of getting to what was agreed at the Paris Accord in 2015 and reaching a global temperature increase of about 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to 1850 to 1900. But the reality is likely to be quite different from there. And indeed, things could get particularly bad if globally we just don't do enough. Then the IPCC is saying that temperature increases could go as high as close to 5% there, the top blue line, by 2100. Now, what does that actually mean for us? What does it mean for the world? Well, again, it doesn't mean great things. Basically, this chart shows us what it will likely feel like if temperatures increase along the left-hand side scale there. So if we take the example of a 3-degree warming in the future, what that actually means is that roughly 3/4 of the world's population will face catastrophic deadly heat events by 2100. They'll experience at least 20 days a year where there will be deadly heat, and that has significant implications for mortality. So that's really, really significant. Just imagine what the landscape of the globe would look like in that context. And that's at 3 degrees warming. And the IPCC, their worst case scenario is that we could get to 5 degrees warming. So that is a very stark scenario that we can't imagine right now, but we certainly wouldn't want to experience. So it's a pretty bleak picture. And it's, I suppose, just painting that picture as to why climate change, why we need to be thinking about sustainable development, not just thinking about it, actually acting on it and acting on it today without delay. And that's also just bringing me to speaking now about, why the central bank is so interested in this topic, quite apart from the good citizen effect that everybody needs to have. The reality is that climate change is an existential threat. There is nobody here in this room or anywhere else that can escape the impacts of climate change. It is true that there will be regional variation. It is true that there are parts of the globe that will be very more harshly impacted by climate change than others. But that said, the implications are stark for everybody. And because of that, it is such a large global problem. Everybody needs to act. There has to be action on the part of all governments, all across the globe, all institutions, every individual. Action is needed to change this. And in that context, climate change is a strategic priority for the central bank. It is something that's called out in our current strategy for 2022 to 2026. And the reason for that is because climate change actually poses very significant risks to our own mandate, our capability to ensure financial and price stability and ensure that the financial system works in the best interest of the public. And I have a couple of references there that might be of interest in the context of this. But in particular, when we think about sustainable development and financing sustainable development, it is particularly worrisome that climate change has a very real possibility of affecting financial stability. I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. And in affecting financial stability, it has a very real possibility of affecting the ability of the financial system to actually finance the investments and the transition that needs to happen to bring the world to a better place. So from that perspective, climate change is something that we do worry about, and we're working hard to incorporate climate considerations into all of the activities that we do at the bank. And that is a large part of what my unit does, the climate change unit. We're a new unit that was only established approximately 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And our purpose is to really drive forward the agenda for the bank with our colleagues right across the bank to actually take this topic seriously and to heart in everything that we do. And there's lots of people across the bank working with us on this. But why specifically do are we really worried about this? And I talked about the financial stability implications. Well, there's two main risks that climate change poses that we're concerned about. One being the physical effects of climate change. We all know, you just have to look at the media on a daily basis, that climate change, the physical climate events are becoming ever more acute, ever more frequent. And indeed, if you just look at simple metrics like the economic losses from those events, you can see on the right-hand side there that those economic losses from acute climate events have been increasing over time. Now, from the financial system perspective, that matters because in a very simple way, if there are economic losses from climate events, that can affect, say, a borrower's ability to repay their debt. If their assets are destroyed because of climate change, in a very simple way, that can affect their capacity to actually just repay their debt. And we all know from the financial crisis what that can mean if a lot of that activity happens, what it can mean for the financial system. That's putting it very simply. Another risk that we are particularly concerned about is what we call transition risks, which are essentially those risks attached to the transition that has to take place. So we know that in an Irish context, we are committed to being net zero country by 2050, but the pace at which we transition to that net zero, the kind of choices that are made, the kind of choices that economic agents make, the kind of choices that our government makes, all those things will have implications for how people react. How, if you think about something like, diesel cars, for example, if tomorrow there was a huge tax on these diesel cars, then the value of those cars would decrease, the capacity for people to purchase those cars would change, the desire for people to purchase those cars would change. So that can lead to things like stranded assets, which means that the assets on whoever's balance sheet, whether it's a financial institution or a household or whatever, can change very quickly, and that can affect obviously financial stability as well. Now, the chart on the left-hand side there just shows greenhouse or carbon dioxide emissions in a historical sense in an Irish context. That's the blue bar. And it gives us some estimate from the Environmental Protection Agency and work by the Climate Change Advisory Council as to where these emissions could go in the future based on announced plans by the government of what the government wants to do in terms of, promoting reductions in emissions over time. And those projections are shown as the yellow or the red line, depending on, whether they're just different measures based on different types of announced government plans. But the basic premise here is that they're quite, regardless of which of those lines you look at, they're quite a far distance from the green line, which is where we need to get to if we're to get to net zero. That brings us in a very simple way in a linear path to 2050 to net zero, which is where we need to go. And there's a huge gap between the red line, for example, and the green line, or the yellow line and the green line. What does that actually tell us? It tells us that government action alone cannot achieve the transition that needs to be achieved. So there's going to have to be significant behavioral and technological change that has to fill this gap. And that change and that gap is going to require very significant investment in a monetary sense. So actually getting to a point where we have sustainable development and sustainable growth is going to be costly, and we're nowhere near there in terms of where we stand today. And I suppose there is, when we think about these kind of two risks, these transition and physical risks, there is a bit of a paradox here, because if we don't do enough in terms of transitioning today, then it means that physical effects of climate change are going to get worse and worse. So the physical risks and the costs of those physical risks will increase. And on the other hand, if we move too quickly with transition, which we're not at risk of doing, by the way, but it's a hypothetical scenario, then the transition costs could increase in ways that we wouldn't be anticipating. And just to give you a sense of what these costs, what these risks might actually mean from a gross domestic product perspective, modeling by the Network for Greening the Financial System has been done, which presents us with this chart, which shows us on the left-hand side there that there are some costs attached to transition, because there has to be some investment in the transition, and that's the kind of middle green bar on the left two bars of this chart here. But of course, there are also physical climate events that are going to happen over the next 20, 30 years, regardless of what we do today, because that's sort of baked in from emissions that have taken place already. But what we see on the right-hand side of this chart is that if we do nothing, if there are no costs borne in terms of transition, if we invest nothing in sustainable development, then the physical implications in terms of GDP costs of that will be very significant and most acutely felt in the period from 2050 onwards. And if you were to drag this out further, I'm sure that these figures would look even worse. So this kind of presents that paradox for us that we have to act now. If we do nothing, just from a simple GDP perspective, it's going to be a very costly endeavor. But that's not to, we've already spoken about the kind of physical, the human cost implications, the kind of worldly implications in the earlier chart as well. So it's not to discount that. So when we talk about transition, then what exactly, knowing that transition has to happen, what do we mean when we think about the cost of actually transitioning to a sustainable state? Well, the thing is that the costs of getting to net zero, well, the estimates are pretty wide ranging, and I've just put a chart up here to give you some sense of how wide ranging those estimates are. There's lots of different, institutions that have been trying to estimate how much euro needs to go in or how much dollar needs to go into this in a global sense. And you can see here the range of estimates. They go from 120 trillion US dollars in aggregate to 2050 versus on the very right hand side there you have close to 300 trillion US dollars. Now that's global, but that's enormous. And regardless of the range we're talking about here, even on the lower end of the scale, it's enormous. I think if I remember correctly from this particular report, they speak about these numbers equating to something like 7.5% of global GDP, I think, on an annual basis. In an Irish context, there's been a couple of estimates thrown around as well, and I think it's something similar. I think the IMF has estimated that we need to be investing roughly, I think, 5% of GDP. Don't quote me on these figures, but that's my memory, on an annual basis to be able to get us to net zero. No one in the world, including Ireland, is anywhere near this. So we're here today to talk about sustainable development. I'm sorry to present such a bleak picture, but it's going to be very hard to get there, and it's going to cost a lot. And there are three main sectors that really account for the total cost, and this is the built environment, energy, and transport. I know some of my colleagues on the panel here are going to talk a little bit more about that later. But that's just to give you a sense of kind of what we have in front of us. Now, in terms of obviously, how do we make this investment happen? And I mentioned government efforts earlier on, but the reality is that the private sector is going to need to do a very big part of this lift. And that can only happen if the financial system itself is capable of transitioning and bringing, finance into these green activities. And that's why, as I mentioned at the outset, the central bank, part of our role is to make sure that the financial system is resilient to the risks posed by climate change, to make sure that the financial system can actually do this job. But actually, there's a lot more to it. So if you think about sustainable investment and sustainable development, if you were asking somebody today to invest in something that is green, the first question would probably be, well, what do you mean by green? There's lots of open questions out there around an architecture that has to be put in place and that is being put in place to actually support this investment and this transition. And the central bank is very actively involved in that, as is, the Department of Finance and others. But essentially, in terms of the financial space, Europe is pushing forward at pace in developing this architecture, the sustainable finance architecture, to enable investment to take place in green activities. And there's lots of questions that are being addressed, such as how do you define green activities and investments? How do we enhance transparency? How do we help an actual investor to understand if what they're looking to invest in is truly green or not? So there's lots of work going on in the regulatory space to address these questions. How can we ensure that consumers and investors are engaged with, that they understand green features of financial products? So, we're starting from a point where none of this information existed a few years ago. So obviously, there's a lot been happening, and in the European context, there's been lots going on in the European Commission around the EU Action Plan on sustainable finance, the European Green Deal, the renewed strategy. And coming out of that, there are lots of, I suppose, requirements for the European kind of supervisory authorities and the central bank to actually take on board and work on some of the recommendations that come out of this to answer some of these questions and put in place the right regulatory architecture to ensure that the financial system, when it's channeling investments towards green, that they're truly green and that it meets all of its other requirements in the space. Just to give you a flavor of this, and I don't expect anybody here to really look at this and understand there's lots of acronyms here unless you're working in the financial sector. You know, there would be too much. What I really wanted you to get a flavor of here is that there are lots of pieces of the puzzle coming together. There's lots of individual components here that put in place requirements for financial institutions to do things like disclose their climate, the risks, the climate risks that they're exposed to disclose the kind of climate content, the various kind of aspects of climate change that relate to the financial products that they offer to consumers and investors in terms of how they advise on those things. There's lots of disclosure requirements and things like that coming in, not just for financial firms, also for non-financial firms. But the key point is that it's coming in on a phased basis. So nothing is resolved overnight. This takes time. And what I would say is that, you know, in a European setting and in a global setting, regulatory development and policy development in this space, in my view, from my personal opinion, has been very, very fast, probably much faster than most other areas of policy and regulation. And that signifies the severity and the urgency, the need to actually make action on this. But it's also creating, obviously, a landscape which needs to be dealt with in a very rapid way. Not just from the central bank's perspective, but also from financial institutions' perspective. And in that context, this means that in this world, when we're talking about climate change and regulation and sustainable finance and sustainable development, there is a need for institutions to work together, to collaborate, to share, to knowledge build. And in that context, that's something that we're very focused on as well in the central bank, having established recently an industry, a cross-sectoral industry forum where we are looking to build capacity and shared knowledge and skills across industry with the central bank and with climate expertise. And those kind of initiatives are very important to deal with very rapidly moving environment. So sorry, just to conclude with some very quick thoughts, I'm conscious that the next person wants to come up. What we do know is that green financial flows, when we look at the data that we can see from Bloomberg and other places around green financial flows, they have been increasing, so that's really positive. They've come from a very low base in the last couple of years. You know, they were non-existent about a decade ago. There was no money flowing into green types of activities and sustainable development as it's currently defined. But there is a very substantial gap that remains to be filled. And what is positive is that the pace of regulatory enhancements has been very rapid. And there have been various kind of disclosure requirements now in operation in the European context and supports in place or coming for growth in sustainable or green financial flows. But there are significant challenges that remain, including with respect to global interoperability of standards and data gaps, for example. So right now, we're moving at pace in Europe, but they're moving at a different pace, let's say in the US, they're moving at a different pace in other parts of the world. And it's going to be really important as we move forward in terms of international dialogue that things start coming together as much as possible so that we've got this kind of consistent approach across the globe, but also so that the types of rules and regulations that we develop here speak to the rules and regulations that are being developed in other places, because from a financial flows perspective, that's very important. Money, capital is global and targets different markets. So that's what I mean by the latter point there, that international cooperation and dialogue and shared capacity and skills building are going to be vital to this piece of the puzzle. Sorry, I rushed through. Obviously, there isn't much time, but as I said, I'm very happy to talk again about any of that. And thank you for your time and your attention. I guess I hand over now to Joe.
So our next speaker is Barra Roantree from the ESRI, member of the Commission on Taxation and Welfare. We will have a Q&A session for both people in the room and online, but we'll wait to the end. but there will be 3 kind of 20-minute presentations. So please have your questions and be patient with that.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction and thank you very much for the invitation to present society this evening. It's great to be here. Even if approaching the RDS, I did get that kind of chill down my back of as I got closer to that venue of the exam hall that I think haunted for so many years, and that's the main. But at least this is, I suppose, for many of us, then the move of the society to the RDS is allowing us to overcome that fear that has built up over many years, and so that's maybe another positive. So I'm going to talk to you even about 15 or so minutes about the role of taxation, I suppose, in trying to achieve our climate goals and targets, which, as Yvonne said very nicely, are, I think, challenging is the euphemism du jour. So there we are. Yes. So my kind of starting point for this is going to be that really, I think, meeting our climate goals is going to require radical tax reform. So the very ambitious targets that we all know that have been set out in the recent Climate Action Plan are to have greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2050. And my starting point for this, I'm not going to spend too much time on justifying this, but I find it very difficult to see how we can achieve these targets without radical tax reform. I think it's going to be very difficult to achieve them full stop, but I think it's going to be even more difficult if we don't have tax reform that leads us in the direction that facilitates this transaction. And maybe kind of 3 quick reasons for that. So first, we know that taxation is a very powerful policy tool that can help us achieve these targets. And again, here even you can think about, turn it a little bit on its head and say, at the very least, it shouldn't be kind of counteracting what we're trying to achieve. And maybe that might be, if we could achieve that for tax policy, that might be in enough, something helpful. Because as I'm going to go on to show you, I think currently as structured, there are lots of bits of our tax system which actually push against trying to achieve what we are here. But in addition to that, I think tax policy can be, a good example is the change to the taxation of cars a few years ago that meant that everyone decided to buy diesel cars for a few years, right? We know tax policy can be an incredibly powerful tool in terms of motivating and changing people's behavior. But so twofold, both we want to stop taxation policy pushing in the wrong direction, but maybe we can actually harness tax policy to help us achieve these objectives. The second bit, and this is maybe kind of a bit of an unpopular and economics view, but the classic kind of economic analysis of climate change would have been that, well, by putting a price on carbon through a carbon tax or cap and trade scheme or whatever, you can, through tax policy, really achieve your climate targets and goals at the lowest economic cost. Now, I think we're some way away from doing that, right? The kind of approach we've taken in Ireland and many other countries is to say, well, instead we're going to decide, we're not going to set the price and allow the most efficient and lowest cost transition towards achieving those targets. Rather, we're going to say, there's only going to be X% cut to agriculture, but there's going to be much higher in terms of transport and built environment, right? And so already you're not in a world of even trying to get, I think, to your targets at the lowest economic cost. But you can at least, I think, again, this goes back to if tax policy can facilitate the direction you're going in, you can reduce those costs. So maybe we're not going to be there at the lowest cost, but we can maybe get it at a bit of a lower cost. And then the third role, and this is kind of, again, going to motivate a lot of what I say during this, is that, tax reform, I think, has a really important role to play in ensuring we have sufficient revenue to finance the necessary spending. So as Yvonne was saying, we're going to require spending large amounts of money on making this transition. And, all well and good at the moment, the corporation tax receipts are rolling in, but we probably shouldn't rely on them for everything. And that seems to be, the direction many of us are, or much of the public discussion think is going to go in that way. But there is also a role for tax reform in making sure that we have sufficient revenue in the years ahead, that we can achieve this, that we can finance this transition, and that we aren't excessively reliant on corporation tax to achieve this transition alongside pay for achieving our housing goals and our welfare goals and everything else, right? So there is a role here, but in general, I think what I'm going to say, I don't think necessarily that the type of tax reform that I want to focus on in what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is more about kind of, I think, structural reform rather than raising revenue. If in terms of if you're thinking about raising revenue, what I think we would want to do, money is fungible. So what we want to do is kind of raise that revenue in a way that does so at the lowest economic cost, right? Where maybe the deadweight lost is least, combined with some kind of distributional objective. So in that sense, where we raise the money for the climate transition shouldn't really be any different to where we raise the money more generally. What I kind of want to focus on instead is kind of how can we make sure that the tax system is not creating disincentives towards that transition, or again, even better, that the tax system creates the right set of incentives that we can kind of transition. So that's kind of maybe my framing for kind of what I want to talk about today. So what I'm going to say then for the next 10 or so minutes, 10, 15 minutes, is set out some directions for tax reform that I think would help mean that the old tax system as a whole is directed towards meeting climate targets and objectives, and hopefully some other ones along the way as well, right? And in doing this, I'm going to be drawing on some economic research, both Irish and international, and the wildly popular report of the Commission on Taxation and Welfare, which no doubt will go on to be read for many years to come, or at least curse that for many years to come. So I want to start off maybe kind of just thinking about some of the sectors again, road tax reform. So transport, I think, is an area where reform is particularly needed, and hopefully, sorry, the bar at the top doesn't have a way of, don't think there's a way of minimizing that, but hopefully you can see just about that there. Way of excellent, yes. Maybe, no, that's not better. Okay, so incidentally, myself and my ESRI colleague Merrion Lynch have had an opinion piece in the Irish Times today talking about this issue, the need for reform in the taxation of driving. You could just take as your starting point for this that again there's about 4 to 5 billion euro per year of revenues which we get from driving at the moment from motoring, and that is incredibly closely linked to the burning of fossil fuels, right? So if you think about, you have excise duties on petrol and diesel, that raises quite a lot of money. You have motor tax, which is linked to the emissions of cars. You have VAT, which is linked to emissions of cars. You have VAT levied on top of some of those. So you have all these revenues, and kind of pretty much all the money that we raise from motoring at the moment is incredibly tightly linked to those cars and burning fuel. But we've said, and our intention is that's not going to be the case for long, right? We've said that there's, we're going to rapidly electrify the fleet and move away from that, which means that those revenues are going to dissipate. Maybe not all of them, right? There's some of them like VRT is still not entirely linked to emissions, but there's a lot of money that's going to dissipate there. And again, unless we want to just say, okay, well, corporation tax revenues are going to fund everything, so it's fine. We will, that will make us increasingly reliant on those, but we probably want to think about how we tax motoring. Maybe we don't need to raise 4 to 5 billion as we currently do. Maybe we can raise something a little bit less, maybe we can raise something more, but the current system is going to need to be reformed. Even just alone from the point of view of raising revenues. But it's not just from that point of view, right? Because we actually, the way that we raise these revenues is increasingly incoherent, and I think a bad system, right? So the way we raise them at the moment, and this kind of looking at motoring and thinking about emission abatement more generally, by raising so much money from fuel duties in particular, we effectively have a carbon price on driving that is much higher than on any other type of activity, right? So if you burn, if you emit a ton of carbon through driving your car, that is much more punitively taxed than a ton of carbon through heating your home through gas, right? And again, it's not a particularly popular view anymore, but the kind of economic analysis will tell us, well, we should at least try to have those things aligned if we want to have lower economic costs of achieving our aims. And so we have a system at the moment which I think actually overly taxes driving or the emissions from motoring, right? And means that we're going to try put more than we might otherwise of the transition onto reducing car use. And on top of that, actually, if you think about driving more generally, think about some other social objectives of motoring comes from congestion. Like it's not even, you look at any of the estimates that are done in countries, you look at those for Ireland, they're kind of even, we're at the higher end of the scale of this, but congestion is the single largest social cost of motoring, and none of the taxes that we levy on motoring at the moment do anything really to address that, to levy those social costs. So I think there is this system of taxes on motoring which is in dire need of reform. Moving towards, and this is in the piece, and the Irish Times saying myself and Merrion suggest this, moving towards in the longer run some kind of time and location dependent road pricing offers a way of kind of reconciling a few objectives, right? It means that you can, one, continue to raise money as the fleet of cars is decarbonized because you're charging something for every kilometre driven, but you're also distinguishing, you're raising more of that, you're charging more per kilometre driven when it's in cities during rush hours. Because in a way, the social costs of driving are very, very low when it's in the country at, maybe not midnight, that might be more linked to other activities that we might worry about and have negative externalities. But, the cost of a kilometre driven in the countryside is very, very low, whereas it's very, very high in the city. We should have a system that recognises that and tries to address it. So we could do that. We could raise, again, it doesn't have to be 4 or 5 billion, but we could raise a lot of money and make the transition easier by raising these revenues in a better way. And you could also do it, and if you do it now, and this is kind of, again, the argument we'll go into in our opinion piece a bit, but if you do it now, when you have these revenues from excise duties, you can cut them. You can give someone, you can use that money to make some people who will be adversely affected better off, or compensate them a little bit. And so there's a kind of a politically, actually now is the best time to do it, when you have some money that you can buy off people that otherwise won't like this change, right? And that's why it actually makes sense to start doing it now, not wait until we have a dart that goes out to the airport, as I think the Taoiseach's phrase was the other day. But okay, so that's just kind of one aspect of motor taxes, right? It's kind of, it's an important one. It's the fuel excise duty. It's moving away from that towards road pricing in the long run, congestion charging and carbon tax in the short run. But we're also going to need to reform our other taxes in motoring, right? Because as I mentioned, motor tax and VRT are both very closely linked. And this is, I think, actually where tax policy can very much be used to drive that transition towards cleaner vehicles, right? So what I'm showing you here is the VRT schedule. So this is the vehicle registration tax. What's shown on the vertical axis is the percent of what's known as the open market selling price that VRT is levied on. So, every vehicle has this open market selling price. What's on the horizontal axis is the measured CO2 carbon emissions from that vehicle. And what you can see is that tax schedule essentially taxes quite, about what, 7% or something for a low emissions vehicle, goes up to maybe 9 or something for those between 50 and 100. And then you have all these little steps, so that we're increasingly kind of taxing on the purchase of a vehicle. VRT, when it's imported into the country, more higher emitting vehicles. But then that kind of like stops off towards the top, right? There's no more staggering things above 200 kind of things. That was changed a little bit in the last budget. They reformed the schedule lift, but left it pretty much unchanged, right? There also changed they found out they'd be mismeasuring emissions, so they updated that as well. All cars got a new way they were measured, but we didn't really tweak things too much. We just kind of like made it a little bit steeper, that line. And so that can kind of help with the transition a bit, but really you could do something much more radical here, right? And you're also, and this goes back to the point on how do we continue to raise the revenue, right? If you look down the bottom here, right, that's where all the cars that are going to be produced will be in the future. And at the moment, that's very low tax. So that line kind of needs to come up if we want to continue to raise money through VRT. I'm not saying we necessarily do, but if you do, you need to raise that line up. But you could also, if you want to accelerate the transition, you could make this more aggressive. You could do something else there. So there's scope there to kind of drive the transition. And I'm not sure it's kind of really doing the most that it could at the moment. So that's transport. Built environment. Here again, I think this is more a question of, we have a system of taxes around the built environment that push against the direction that policy is kind of trying to go, right? So decarbonizing the built environment, so both the residential and the commercial kind of houses, buildings, all the rest of it, that is made a lot trickier by the fact that we have incredibly inconsistent carbon price across fuel sources and users. So just going to go through this, and I was trying to get some calculations on this and couldn't quite get it. I might see if I can slip it into the published version if I can get the table out in time. But we have the emissions trading system, the EU ETS. That price is now substantially higher than the carbon tax, right? And the EU ETS applies to our power generation sector. Carbon tax applies to kind of gas, solid fuels, petrol, all the rest, right? Now that wasn't always the case. It was the other way around. So we had very different price, but the carbon tax had been higher than the ETS. Now the ETS is much higher than carbon tax. But we also have lots of free allowances under the ETS to certain large or favored users. And we also have many exemptions from the carbon tax for particularly favored sections. So, agricultural diesel, one example there, but not the only one. So one, that gives you a very different carbon price across sources and users, which makes it harder to achieve the transition, certainly at the lowest economic cost, even at a low economic cost, which is going to make, pushes back against that. On top of that, you've got the public service obligation, usually levied, although this year it's going to be a reimbursement, and that's paid on electricity bills, but not gas bills. And it's paid at different rates for households and businesses. Indeed, it's paid at different rates for certain businesses, for large businesses and small businesses. So you have this carbon tax, you have this carbon price, which varies wildly across your users and your sectors. And then on top of all that, we've got implicit subsidies for any form of energy consumption that come from the reduced rates of VAT that we apply. So, the entire system of taxation that we've got around things that go toward the built environment really doesn't make much sense, and kind of it makes it certainly, I think, harder to achieve our objectives. On the parallel side, and I'm going to stray momentarily from tax in a pure form to kind of grants here, but really these are just negative taxes. We can think of it those ways, right? So there is similarly if not more, variation in how we kind of design our grants for energy saving and energy efficiency, right? So a paper by one of my colleagues, John Curtis, and co-author of his in 2017, looked at the Better Home Scheme over a 5-year period. And they found that if you look, if you look at all the grants that were available through that, and you measured, well, how much of a grant do you get per kilowatt hour per meter squared per year that you save from that activity? So for insulation versus, say, double glazed windows versus heat pumps or whatever, the range across all the different grants for that was between 62 cents per kilowatt hour per meter squared per year to 4,545 euro, right? There's this absolutely astronomical range of subsidy that we're given for different activities with no real coherence to it, right? And it's what is our objective here? Our objective here is to get houses to reduce their energy dependence, to use less, and yet we're paying a subsidy that varies by what orders of magnitude. I think I'm comfortably able to say there, but like by 4,000, and the mean I think was something like 20 euro, so per kilowatt hour per meter squared. So we don't have really a coherent system of subsidies. That's kind of all over the place. Maybe it's gotten a little bit better, but it's not really any. There's still not a particularly coherent approach to that. We don't design these subsidies in mind that you'll get X, you get a single X euro per kilowatt hour per meter square per year that you save. But on top of that, we've now got a situation where we're going to, apparently as of last week, we're going to have 0 VAT on solar panels, but 13.5% VAT on heat pumps, insulation, triple glazed windows. Now, okay, maybe you could say, well, solar panels are, their technology in Ireland is such a big market in the world that by putting all this demand on them, we can help bring down the price. But we're not, we're a tiny bit of the world market. And solar panels have been coming down in price rapidly. So why is it that we're putting 0% VAT on solar panels, but we're keeping 13.5% on all these other forms of energy efficiency? When, again, the objective is to decarbonize the houses. Why are we making all these decisions about will be particularly more expensive or less expensive to do it in this way? So again, this is one where I think just the tax environment makes it a lot more costly and a lot more difficult to achieve our objective, which is the decarbonisation of the built environment. Related to that is kind of the built environment is our taxation of land. So the way that we tax land in this country discourages density. So commercial rates is kind of the prime culprit of what I'm thinking of here. I would comfortably class this as our worst designed tax in the country, and that is not particularly a low benchmark to hurdle. But what commercial rates is right, it's essentially a taxation of intermediate input, which is something that Economic 101 tells us not a good idea, not a great idea. But not only that, but it discriminates between different sorts of business, right? So we have agricultural land exempt. But not only that, if you go on, and I highly recommend that in your spare time that you spend some time, some leisure time looking through the valuation office map of the valuations for different premises around the country. And what you can see is that buildings will have their valuation determined by whether they are retail, A, B, C, whether it's a store, whether it's a garage. The number of classifications for land is absolutely astonishing, right? And again, so what we have is this discrimination in terms of across different types of business, where we're saying, well, certain types of business shouldn't really be using land as an input, other businesses should. And also, if you improve the way in which you use that land, if you build higher on that land, we're going to tax you more for it as well. And commercial rates is substantial, right? It's over $1 billion a year, and really the biggest source of revenue for all of our local authorities. On top of that, we then have, and this is getting a little less bad recently, but we have across most local authorities still reduced or often 0 rates for vacancy. So if you have a property, commercial property, but you leave it empty, we'll exempt you from rates entirely. And there's also then an effective subsidy for surface level car parks, right? So if you build a multi-story car park, and you'd say have a little, right, and you put the parking underneath and you put the little on top, you're still going to pay the exact same rates. In fact, you're going to pay more because you're making better use of sites. But the car park, you're not going to pay any less for the car parking than you would if you had a surface level kind of surrounding the area. So commercial rates is this completely archaic, terribly designed system that discourages density and encourages sprawl, right? So this is, I think, one of the Commission on Tax and Welfare recommendations that I'm most happy with. I think is one that probably got the least discussion, but one that I think would be the most, if one thing came from it, and it was this, I think would be a great job done. But replacing the system of commercial rates with a land value tax, I think would really allow us to would further our climate and housing aims quite considerably, right? You would have denser development no longer resulting in higher rates bills, and you'd encourage the development of underutilized sites, subject to the constraints of our glorious planning system, of course. Just one word then further on the taxation of land, right? This is an example, actually, this is taken from a paper which is now online, the meeting 17 briefing paper of Commission on Tax and Welfare. But this figure here shows just the rate, if it just pulled from the rates, valuation office rates map. A certain shopping centre in West Dublin, beside M50 Junction 7, the N4, for anyone who might be able to work that out. But and you know it when you go by, right? Like, and you can see here, right? So you have all the dots there, the valuations that have been given, and then you have this massive car parking space around it, right? And they would get a higher rates bill if they replaced all that car parking space with, say, you know, keep car parking underneath it, but if you want, there probably shouldn't be as much car parking out there, right? But if you turn one of those car parking spaces into further additional buildings, and you put maybe you kept some underground car parking there, or you put multi-story in, you'd end up paying more in commercial rates, right? So this just kind of illustrates just how mad of a system commercial rates is, and again, how moving towards a land value tax would really encourage much denser development. So you know, here's an example of, again, you can think of more kind of rural areas and rural towns. This is, I think, Barra, an example taken from, but you know, again, what rates creates is a very strong incentive to locate your shopping centre out of town rather than in town with less car parking spaces and maybe multi-story car park where the you know, the little or the alley or whatever is built over. So I think that again, this is just an example of where the tax system is really pushing against what we're trying to achieve in other areas, and something which I think we really do need to reform if we want to achieve our goals. And so finish up just by saying, you know, tackling any of these issues that I mentioned is going to be very, very challenging, right? I'm not pretending any of the things that I've mentioned aren't hugely politically difficult issues, and not to mention, you know, there's lots of technical issues in how you can approach that. Land value tax is not a simple thing to do. I think it could be done. I think the difficulties with it are overstated, but that, you know, I'm not kind of saying it could be done overnight or anything, right? But so any of the reforms that I kind of pushed toward or pointed towards or described are going to be difficult and are going to be challenging. And I haven't even touched on things like the landfill levy, right? That was it's effective methane tax, right? It's in place since 2013, unchanged, despite the fact the carbon tax is going up, despite the fact the ETS is going up. So again, another example of our gloriously inconsistent carbon prices across things. There's this accelerated capital allowances for a scheme, right? So you essentially get to write off any investment, business or self-employed person even in the year that you make it against your tax. But it has to be from an SEAI approved list. And if you look at this, and if you look at the last few years, like in the most recent year, right, there's an accelerated capital allowance. You would think that this would be, you think everyone would be throwing money into this. You think this would be incredibly, and as Yvonne mentioned earlier, we really need the private sector to contribute in terms of its spending. That we really harness that. There's been 9 million cost for about 1,000 claims. So this is tiny. This is a pittance that's been kind of being used here. So why is that? Why is no one using the scheme? Is it because of administrative complexity or what? But really, you know, you would think that that should be something that the cost is so high that the Department of Finance are starting to get worried about it, right? But instead, it's not. It's something that doesn't even, you know, I had to search repeatedly on the revenue statistics tables to make sure I could find it, and it was just hidden away in there. You know, CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, landmark EU proposal to essentially put in place some kind of, you know, tariff that depend on countries that don't have some kind of equivalent carbon price. Really kind of coherent, sensible proposal, but also has the potential to spark trade wars. So, that's a big issue in terms of the tax environment and climate change. And then we've got aviation and maritime fuel, right? Completely indefensibly tax exempt. So all of those issues and many, many more that I haven't mentioned. But what I kind of want to just very lastly finish up by saying is that, you know, I think we all know that we have very little chance of meeting these very demanding, very challenging targets without really radical change. And avoiding tax reform, I think, is only going to make the task harder. I think I hope you try to point a few areas in which some tax reform could at least make the task a little bit easier, but I think could also actually contribute significantly towards the challenge of financing sustainable development. So I'll finish up there and thank you very much.
Thank you, Barra. So our last paper, and then we will have a Q&A, is Joseph Cummins from Climate Action and from the Climate Action and Economic Infrastructure Unit in the Enterprise Strategy, Competitiveness and Evaluation Division in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So we look forward to this paper. Thank you. Presentation.
Great, thanks so much, William Business there. Hi, I'm Joe Cummins. I'm from the Department of Enterprise. Despite the extremely worthy title, you can think of me as the head of the Climate Action Unit in the Department of Enterprise. not as complicated as it sounds. Thanks for having me today. It's been a really interesting session already, two really interesting presentations. Where I'm coming from is enterprise policy. Our department is responsible for transitioning our industrial development and enterprise base in line with the government's ambition to address climate change and to comply with our carbon ceilings, etc. Some of what I'm going to be talking about is definition Department of Enterprise policy. Some of this is more of my own thoughts and views, so I'm giving myself a little caveat there. I'm not necessarily speaking for the departments at all moments. So you can quiz me afterwards on what's my own view and what's the department line, and I'll carefully fudge that issue if necessary. So where are we in enterprise policy? You know the enterprise environment we're operating in. We've just come through a fairly volatile 2 years with Brexit, COVID, and energy crisis, and our enterprise base is of course dealing with the impacts of those pretty seismic shocks to the system and to the economy that they're all operating in. That has been the key focus of enterprise policy. We're trying to keep our businesses alive, trying to keep them trading, trying to keep them competitive and exporting. So that's been the driving force of enterprise policy in the last few years. A key development, obviously, with the Low Carbon Development Act in 2021, which sets out our carbon budgeting process. That binds the government as a whole and individual ministers to carbon ceilings, which is essentially a carbon budget for various sections of our economy. We're kind of moving out of that crisis phase, hopefully, touch wood, and we're thinking strategically about what is the future of enterprise policy, how do we position ourselves in the next 10 years. So what we know is going to be a pretty transformative decade in terms of complying with those carbon ceilings and positioning ourselves for what we think will be a radically changed low carbon economy from 2030 onwards. In that, with that aim, the white paper on enterprise was published at the end of last year. It's not a bad read if you're interested in that kind of thing. It's a worthwhile document, and it really sets out that decarbonisation and enterprise policy are now one and the same. We do think that being a low carbon location, decarbonising our business and being a destination for investment that is low carbon is the future of enterprise policy. We will not have a competitive economy if we are not thinking very seriously about the structural changes required to operate in that low carbon or on the trajectory to zero carbon, as Yvonne very clearly set out for us in the first presentation. So that's the enterprise policy background. The international context, which has been touched on too, is EU development. We're essentially being hit with a raft of EU legislation, some of which has been mentioned, some of which hasn't. But everything from rapidly increasing targets in our emissions to our renewable electricity, our building performance, our energy sector, CBAM, as Barra mentioned. So there's a raft of regulation coming nationally and at EU level, which is of course driving our engagement with businesses. More recently, obviously, the energy crisis and REPowerEU is setting a changed framework for energy policy broadly, and that is also having a significant impact on how we think about what the future of enterprise and industrial development looks like. And of course, there's the international market forces, plenty of which Yvonne touched on in her presentation. Markets are changing, they're pricing in risk, they're allocating capital to things that they think will be a sustainable investment over time. That is not uniform. It is not happening cleanly. It's quite volatile. There's a wide variety of standards and financial products out there, but that is definitely a shift in markets, and that is focusing the mind of corporates and boards and enterprises, because essentially they want to be able to access capital and they need to be able to position themselves as a sustainable investment, and that means being consistent or consistent to the extent possible with some of these objectives. To position where our department is in this, you'll generally see the whole economy emissions. We have a whole of economy carbon budget that's broken down into sectoral emission ceilings for various sectors of the economy. The government decided in the summer of 2022 Two, that the sector emissions ceiling for industry would be about a 35% reduction by 2030 and a 45% reduction in our built environment. The buildings in which enterprise happens, or the commercial premises, or non-domestic buildings, depends what definition you want to use. But some of that target obviously is relevant to businesses because that's where they operate and where they do business. So I just wanted to put the focus of our department in context. It's a sizable chunk of our overall, the overall pie essentially, and it is driving our minister and our department in terms of the steps that we need to take to get our sector on trajectory to comply with those carbon ceilings. I'm not going to go into the detail of all these technical measures that will be required to comply with those carbon ceilings. I'm putting them up here because it really frustrates me when people stand up and talk about the transition to low carbon or the transition to 50% reduction in 2030 and don't say what that means. I think as civil servants and policymakers and policy advocates, we should be demystifying this to the extent possible. What does that mean? So for industry, it means electrifying low temperature heat, anything up to about 130 degrees. It means using biomass and biogas to decarbonize high temperature heat. It means a significant program in energy efficiency. At the moment, most manufacturing processes heat water to make steam, pump it around the system, and then take it off again and cool it to various temperatures in order to manufacture foods, pharma, all sorts of different processes. In short, it's highly inefficient, and there are significant gains from better designing our manufacturing processes before we even get into fuel switching and integrating renewables into the manufacturing processes. So I won't concentrate on these. These are the measures that we know have to get us to our 35% target by 2030 and put us on the right track to go to net zero in 2050. In the built environment, there's a range of existing programs. Barra not so kindly referencing some of them there. We know there's a serious job of work to do here. The built environment is probably one of the most complex areas to decarbonize because essentially it requires a lot of individual small decisions in a lot of individual small places. The owners of buildings, the occupiers of buildings. It is a challenging area. Our department will this year develop a roadmap for our commercial premises, and I think maybe picking up on some of Barra's points, develop a more streamlined and coherent set of supports and incentives so we can have confidence that we are pushing the businesses and the building owners in the right direction on our built environment. And all of this, of course, is enabled by also decarbonizing our electricity system. A lot of what will decarbonize enterprise is electrification, and that only makes sense if we are also decarbonizing our electricity system. And you'll be aware of our renewable energy targets in the electricity system. All of this has to happen in a wider economic context. If this was the only thing we were trying to do in the next decades, it would be extremely challenging. Unfortunately, we have to do it as we do everything else. That's how public policy works. So we have an expanding population, we have a growing economy, we're already hitting capacity constraints in our construction sector and international supply chains. And we've had constraints on our energy system, not just in international energy prices, but we have a domestic constraint in our energy infrastructure, which is curtailing what we can do in the short term. So we have to solve the problem of climate change, which is a fundamental existential problem. I completely agree with the previous speakers in that. But solving that problem means solving quite a few other problems as well. So that's a broader economic context and the environment in which we're operating. Thinking from my department and the policy that we are making, we're up against some implementation barriers as well. First of all, we have to get businesses on board. They have to understand what they're being asked to do. They have to be capable of making the investment decisions that we need them to make in order to get them on the trajectory to comply with our carbon budgets. That's not an easy decision for individual business to make. They've already made investments. They have processes in place. They have production lines. They have supply chains. They have locked in investments, in other words. So that investment decision requires a whole range of incentives. It requires careful planning, and we need to bring our enterprise base with us. As Yvonne alluded to, this isn't something government is going to be able to achieve on its own. It will require decisions all across our economy, and we need to lay the groundwork in enterprise policy so that our enterprise base is aware of those decisions and capable of making them in a timely fashion. The CapEx, the OpEx, the return on investment is challenging in some of these cases. A lot of businesses look at return on investment of about 3.5 to 5 years as a good payback period on any particular capital investment. Some of what we're talking about simply doesn't provide that return on investment. That's highly dependent on what energy costs are or fuel inputs in, but we will have to incentivize them to make longer term decisions and essentially have a longer payback period on some of the investments that we need them to make in order to be consistent with our sectoral ceilings. It's not all doom and gloom. There's a massive opportunity here. The global economy is going to spend trillions and trillions of dollars on this, and if you spend trillions of dollars on anything, you create huge commercial opportunities to provide services, to provide products into that market, essentially to provide the solutions. Ireland isn't trying to do this in a vacuum, we're trying to do this globally. If we can solve some of those harder to solve problems in Ireland, we're unlocking a global market for solutions that can be developed at home. At a macro level, there's significant opportunities from our renewable resources. You're all be aware of, particularly offshore wind. We have the scale of the resource that is continental rather than just matching the Irish domestic needs. So there is significant opportunity in unlocking the technology, the investment, and the opportunity in the transition. At an enterprise level, obviously, there's also opportunities. It's developing those products and services. Ultimately, a lot of this will save on costs. We're doing things more efficiently, doing things more cleanly, especially when you talk about a carbon tax or carbon price that is putting a serious value on your environmental externality. Then we are, it's becoming much more commercially imperative, frankly, that businesses do this. It's not just an environmental decision, it makes good business sense in an awful lot of cases. So that's the sort of enterprise policy context. This is a really basic public policy idea. You have carrots and sticks. The carrots are your taxes, your regulations, changes to customer preferences, and some conditionality on state supports or incentives. Your carrots are, funding, and the opportunity to develop products to have been really decarbonized enterprise. And really, enterprise policy is focused on the gears in the middle. If we get those incentives right, and I think it's clear that we have a lot of work to do to get those incentives right. But if we get those incentives right, we need businesses that are capable of internalizing those incentives, seeing what investment decisions are necessary in their own business, being able to access the finance to do that, which is the subject of the symposium today, and then being able to access the technology and supply chain to do that. So it's pretty simplistic, but it gives an idea of how we need to think about enabling our enterprise base to participate in this transition. So that's the white paper on enterprise. What does it say we're going to actually do to implement this? First of all, it's essentially saying that decarbonization is enterprise policy. It's not an add-on. It's a core feature of how we think about the future of business in this country, and would essentially become, alongside sort of value add and employment, how we'll measure ourselves in terms of developing our enterprise base. That means essentially bringing carbon assessment into everything we do, into how we grant fund enterprise support, how we look at employment support, how we essentially everything that our enterprise agencies do. You'll have seen in the IDS, Enterprise Ireland have a massive event on downstairs. Enterprise Ireland, IDA, and our local enterprise offices essentially are the implementing bodies for a lot of enterprise policy, and we will build carbon assessments into how they go about their business. That means a change in the types of things they'll support, the type of sectors that they'll target, and the type of businesses we can then expect into the future. Everything from research and development funding to capital grants will consider the impact of carbon in their investments, and that will drive a pretty fundamental change, I think, in how enterprise policy looks to achieve its outcomes in the coming year. So that's sort of a bullet point format of the things that these sort of implementation actions to put that into practice. To come back to the theme of the symposium, And I'm very lucky that Yvonne covered this really well. But that quote from Mark Carney comes from his The Tragedy of the Horizon speech. If you want to read one speech on how finance is going to be used to unlock this, that's a really good place to start. As Yvonne said, this is going to be volatile. Markets are going to price in the risk of physical damage due to climate change. They're going to price in the risk to businesses because of changing markets, because of changing regulations, and they're going to price in opportunities of companies and investment opportunities that facilitate the transition. How do we make sure that that private capital is going to the right place? At the moment, it's a pretty fragmented picture. There's all sorts of greenwashing and mislabeling going on, and we have a job of work to do to ensure that we're providing clear investment signals so that investors know what they're putting their money against, and clear policy trajectory so that they understand that what they're putting money against is consistent with what policy and regulation is trying to achieve. Essentially, they're trying to minimize risk. We need to give them the clearest possible signals and information in order to make those allocation decisions. Some of those things Yvonne talked about. The EU taxonomy of sustainable activities is sort of a key piece of European-wide agreement on this is a sustainable activity. This is the criteria you have to meet to be considered sustainable. And that gives us all a sort of a hand guide to what we think is consistent with our targets and what we don't think is consistent with our targets. And we have various corporate reporting requirements that will roll in behind that taxonomy and give regulatory support, I suppose, to the types of activities that we want to see more of. Barra mentioned the ETS scheme, and I think this is underplayed or misunderstood. Well, less understood as a key lever for achieving this transition. I've heard corporates in the last year talk about carbon in a way that they never talked about it before, and it's because the price has gone up by 3 to 4x. They are factoring this into their balance sheet now, and it's driving C-level and board decisions. The price has made all the difference in terms of where companies are focused, and that is driving commercial decisions. But to give you some hope that this is now a commercial prospect and we will see capital and investment decisions follow that. It's by no means a clear picture or a clear trajectory. I think it will be volatile, but these signals are now starting to have an impact in how corporates are allocating their funding. How do we make funding decisions as a state? Well, in enterprise policy, we need to think about both. Are we enabling our businesses to make the right decisions? And are we then helping to make that decision? It's no use simply supporting capital investment if they're investing in the wrong processes or they haven't fully understood their supply chain. There's all sorts of unintended consequences that come from it. So it's a capacity building and capability supporting role for enterprise policy, and then to the extent necessary, supporting the capital investments that will decarbonize our large industry. So that means an appropriate level of state support where there's a long payback period, and we need to change the commercial decision essentially to reduce the return on investment so that there's a good commercial incentive for corporates to take part. It also means that we have to get down to brass tacks and monitor ourselves. We need to know what is the cost of a ton of carbon per abatement project. How does the state know it's going to achieve that? So essentially setting ourselves value for money targets and then monitoring the impacts of projects afterwards, supporting them to know what we're achieving and to learn as we go. This is relatively new to policymakers and enterprise agencies. Undoubtedly, we'll make mistakes as we go, but hopefully we'll put the practices in place so that we can learn as investments are made and see what's successful, what's achieving significant abatements at a good value for money, both for the business, but also for the taxpayer, where the taxpayer is supporting that investment. In the wider public realm, I think a shadow price of carbon for public investment is really going to be one of the core tools so that the government and the state can understand what is the carbon impact of the investments that it's making. I would say implementation of that is patchy at the moment. We don't fully understand the lifetime carbon impact of a road or an airport or a hospital or a school, or indeed, an industrial development plant. We need to much better understand that in order to allow the government to make decisions that is ensuring the taxpayers' money is being used to achieve the outcomes that the government has set for itself. So we have various ways in which we do that. We provide the Green Transition Fund, environmental aid, and SCAI supports to large manufacturers. There's also various supports to smaller enterprises. And we'll have to fine tune those as we go to know where we're getting value for money, as in what is the carbon abated per euro spend in different sectors of our economy. Alongside our enterprise development activities, we want a vibrant enterprise base that is capable of being resilient in what could be a fairly volatile transition to a low carbon economy. This is why I'm straying away from the departmental line and giving you my own thoughts on it. I think we have seen quite significant changes in the investment models and the financing arrangements that are being brought to market now. Seeing much higher use of energy performance contracts. We're seeing much greater use of corporate purchase power agreements, where large corporates are essentially stepping into the market and buying renewables directly, providing the upfront finance for renewables to bring them onto our system. I think there's further to go. I think the idea of carbon contracts for difference or other financing methods that essentially bring certainty for industry. Often it's not the actual price that matters, it's the ability to, into the future, have confidence in your market or your input prices. If we can give them certainty that carbon is on a trajectory, a very clear price signal is there, and they can make their investment decisions based on the future cost of carbon and essentially set themselves up to avoid the cost of the environmental damage into the future. And that's about policy certainty. We need to give them as clear signals as possible so they can understand the decisions that they have to make, and that they can clearly demonstrate the commercial and environmental return on investment that we need them to see, because we will need their investment to comply with our sectoral ceilings. There's other opportunities around carbon offsets. I know it's a controversial topic because it's essentially associated with greenwashing in the financial industry. But if we had a robust model of carbon offsets that really did bring abatements to the market and didn't disincentivize the decarbonisation we need in our own industrial facilities and in our own economy, then I think that could unlock significant capital as the transition progresses. And I think that's a policy area worth exploring internationally. I think we'll see more of that in the coming years. I guess the key points that I want to leave with you as a policymaker is we're operating in a volatile environment. The last 2 years have showed us that energy prices can fluctuate wildly. Energy policy is likely to change. They're talking about electricity market reform at EU level that could pretty profoundly change the incentives for customers, for generators, for citizens. At the same time, precisely what I've just been referring to is we need to provide a level of certainty so that companies can make 10, 15-year investments in decarbonising. In a volatile environment, it's very hard to see that 10 to 15-year uncertainty. So the challenge, I think, for policymakers and those that advise and educate them is how do we give a level of certainty as to the transition, provide that clear investment case for the decarbonising technologies, while at the same time being agile enough to respond to what will be a volatile situation and a changing policy environment internationally and a changing energy market internationally that we all have to participate in. So thanks for your attention. That was kind of a whirlwind tour of how enterprise policy is looking at this challenge. But like other speakers, really happy to continue the conversation now and after this session. Thanks very much.
So thank you, everyone. So I'm going to take some questions from the floor and from online. So Paul Sweeney, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, now I've written my question down, so and I can't see it. Wait till I see where it is, but it's aimed at Yvonne. It basically, I'm asking you the question. I thought your presentation was very helpful indeed, but will the central bank, my question, it begs, what will the central bank actually do? Will it move from nudging to a more from a carrot to a more stick approach to get banks that are continue lending to fossil fuel companies, to mining companies and so on? Not immediately, because I believe in a transition time until we get the green alternatives up and running. But once we do, and once they're chugging along, will the central bank actually tell banks, you cannot lend to those fossil fuel companies? And it is difficult, because do you stop lending to people who are buying houses that are leaking CO2? The OECD published a report today that shows Ireland its housing is pretty CO2 leaking in direct losses of heat. You can look at that report yourself. But the question is, what will you do? And again, I do appreciate that you might have to give your own opinion rather than that of the bank, especially as the bank probably is still evolving its opinion.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I collect questions. So anyone here on the floor? Yeah. Go ahead. Just say your name. Speak louder or come up to the top.
Owen Barra, Statistical Office. I had a question about subsidies. So Barra mentioned how they're not very consistent when you look at them in the big picture. And my question really is for speaking from the Department of Enterprise. Is the Department of Enterprise or some other entity going to look at making those consistent? Presumably there's a coordinating role involved in doing that. I was just wondering whether that's part of the goal as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
So I think the three of us spoke about sort of volatility and uncertainty. I think one of the additional risks in this transition is potentially to political stability. So there are losers and worse losers, and introducing these substantial changes requires some sort of political and social conclusion to really clear the steepness. How do we think about that to implement changes?
Great question. Martina.
I'm Martina Lawless from the ESRI, and for all three speakers was really interesting. The couple of kind of themes that came across maybe all three of them was, first of all, what's the definition of green? And if you're saying we're going to either subsidize or penalize green investment against non-green investment, are you setting up, this came up a little bit in the European context, that was the best sometimes the enemy of the good? If you're trying to shift people to total zero carbon, do you stop them from taking intermediate improvement steps? And how to kind of like look at that as a continuum rather than a kind of a binary thing. In terms also of kind of how you get people to invest in the new technologies, while, as Yvonne said, not completely destroying the value of existing assets. Is there a path there in terms of subsidies for the good versus penalties for the bad, gradually sort of converging over time, or is there a role for both to happen simultaneously? And then the very last point, across all of them, is very much, we talked a lot about what was happening here and a little bit in Europe. But there is an incentive that if Europe sets very high standards, that a lot of these carbon heavy industries are just exported to the rest of the world. So in terms of that sort of risk of sort of exporting the pollution, should the focus really be on kind of taxing and incentivizing the consumption side of things rather than the production side? And I guess that's a particular issue for the Department of Enterprise schemes.
Okay, any more questions, Chris? And then
Facilities and Statistics Office, a couple of weeks ago, we produced a publication called The Economic Intensity of Emissions. And we were trying to develop a range of denominators to look at emissions by GP, GPA, GMXR. And one of the things that came out of that first was the concentration of emissions issues in Ireland. So from that point of view, I'd ask each speaker a quick question. So for Yvonne, what should Ireland be investing in? Get Ireland's emissions down. For Barra, I was going to ask the question about a particular subsidy. I really interested. You mentioned agricultural dairy subsidies. Your view on that. Maybe for Joe, you put up the icon for transport as cars, but what's our policy toward airlines?
One last question, and I'll let the speakers answer. Michael, yeah.
It just strikes me a lot of the discussion is about one side of the equation. So you're reducing the production of, say, carbon emissions. What about the other side, which is increasing the absorption? Are we doing the best job we might in relation to that? Good taxation, for example, encourage people to use more carbon hungry plants. Carbon dioxide is improving all the vegetation in the world. You could imagine it might be better to put a garden on one's roof than solar panels. You could have hanging gardens of Dublin. And this could contribute quite significantly, to getting that zero.
Yeah.
So it's just an awful lot of stuff seems to be about reducing, which is great. Surely there are things that are done on the other side of the balance. And in other countries also, we were still cutting the rainforests in Brazil, which is
Excellent. Encouraging carbon absorption. So I think it's best if the speakers come up and speak from the podium. I think people online will understand better and hear better. So I don't know who wants to go first. They're all running up. The difficult questions, but here we go.
I think I'm relatively few, so I can go first. Maybe can I just well, on Chris's first on. I thought I'd take a name and enough sacred cows, but if you what do you bring up the dairy industry? Look, to be honest, I'm not so sure about the value of the tax system, I think, in terms of agriculture and what it does there in terms of, say, any kind of cow tax or anything like that, right? It's a product that is largely exported, and I think there's a whole set of issues there of, are you just, is that really the best approach? Whereas I think in terms of the agricultural context, one role where tax definitely does have a role to play is on the inputs and how and what is used there. And there are a whole bunch of exemptions for agriculture, agricultural diesel, for example. So there, I think that might be a better place to look at if one is thinking about the role of taxation in agriculture, rather than on maybe sometimes kind of the focus of media discussion, but should we have a tax per cow or whatever like that. I think it'd be more important to get right the kind of the implicit subsidies that are there and the tax system creates in terms of the inputs to agriculture, and in particular in differentiating agriculture from other sectors, because again that imposes greater costs on the kind of emission abatement efforts as a whole. In terms of just briefly on Michael brought, I think it's a very good and sensible point, and in a way speaks a little bit to my amusement at why it is that solar panels are the sole thing that should have a 0% VAT rate, and just something, what we want is emissions abatement. Why are we so wedded to the form that it takes, and why should it be in that particular form? And I think moving towards a system where we have a consistent, again, if we are going to give tax relief or we are going to give subsidies, it is per ton of carbon emission saved approach, or at least try to approximate that and be relatively neutral on the form that it takes. And I think that's entirely sensible and correct approach. And finally, then just on the political risks point that Tara raised, maybe kind of two things that are kind of related here. So first, just because it's thing on my mind at the moment is congestion charging, deeply unpopular policy, as would be road pricing, moving towards much more wider time and location based road pricing. But again, I think one can reduce, and I think we indeed heard exchanges in the Oireachtas and the Dáil this week, a testament to that, of people saying this will be incredibly unpopular and people will be back on the street and all the rest. But I think that's precisely why it's important as you think about how you're going to reform that system now, because when you have those revenues that you can compensate people. So again, to a bit more into what myself and Merrion writing about today in our point is simply that you have all these non-carbon component of excise duties on fuels, which are quite substantial, I think between 30 and 40 cents per litre. One could look at, reducing, if not eliminating them entirely, while introducing a system of road pricing or congestion charging. And while doing that, what do? You're going to mean that hauliers are better off. You're going to mean that taxi drivers are better off. You're going to mean that rural people are better off because while they're still using these petrol and diesel cars, they're suddenly no longer paying the fuel duty, right? Taxi drivers are only going to pay a congestion charge going into town once. So it is highly likely you'll be able to offset for those groups who might be politically sensitive groups to something like road pricing. You'll be able to buy them off while you have the revenues to do that. But if you wait, as was suggested, until all our vehicles are electrified and we don't have any revenue that we can buy people off, I think that gets a lot more tricky. So that's why I think it is important to do it now. And then there's kind of the related thing, and so that's in a way kind of related, not directly about the kind of the decarbonisation, but in terms of carbon tax, again, I think there are huge political risks, and I think we have done well as a country, and the government has done well, and successive governments, I should say, have done kind of relatively well on this, and using those revenues to compensate people. And there has been attention and interest given to that, and there's certainly, God knows if the ESRI do enough work on how one can do that. And I think that has been relatively successful today. Will it continue to be? I'm not sure, but I think it does at least illustrate the type. I think that's maybe an area where there has been particular attention paid to the political risks and trying to compensate the losers. And that if one doesn't rush it, if one tries to actually think about these things, that you can actually design a scheme which can mitigate that. And from that point of view, again, the carbon example, I think, does suggest to me that this can be successful. That if you do use those revenues to compensate the losers, and that you can maybe make this politically a bit an easier thing to do, and that might be something that we should try to do more widely rather than kind of being forced and rushed into doing something at the last minute. So I think they're all the ones that were kind of maybe relevant, particularly to me, and I will let whoever is next up wants to give a go.
I'm going to go second, so hopefully Yvonne can answer the hard questions that I left at the end. Obviously, I'm straying into my own personal opinions here. These were not good news of the departments. That's my caveat off of that out there quickly. The job of ensuring consistency across different levels of subsidies. Where does that fall? Look, it's a challenge across government. Fundamentally, I guess it falls to the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, which decides overall how the government spends its money. I think the development of the shadow price of carbon, which is work they're working on, is a good step towards that, because it essentially measures all departments against the same stick and says, okay, so what value are you getting in terms of abatement for investments in different parts of the economy? But the political reality is that with sectoral emission ceiling, the cost of abatement is not the same across those sectors. And fundamentally, the investment is not going to be linear in those sectors to achieve the level of abatement that the government has set them. There's also, the capability to invest, the willingness to invest. The rational economic model of carbon price, essentially, we do the most efficient outcome because everybody's pricing in the exact abatement is nice, but it's not how the economy fundamentally works. Different actors behave in different ways, have different investment appetites, different risk appetites, and different levels of knowledge and understanding of the role they're going to play. And there are disadvantaged parts of our society that simply don't have the attention span, scope, financial resources to take some of those investment activities that they might take if we were, looking for the most cost-effective unit of abatement at any given moment. So I'm not really answering your question, and I accept the logic of it, and it is certainly a challenge that we are paying different amounts in different sectors for different units of abatement. Some of that is going to be the political reality of the transition, but I think a shadow price of carbon and a value for money assessment in the different sectors at least allows departments looking at different sectors to say, okay, well, in the industry sector, I'm better off spending money on this rather than that, and at least policymakers can have a clear decision of the trade-offs that they're making. I'm not going to comment too much on political cohesion. We are obviously apolitical as a civil servant. I think in the industry sector, we are trying to demonstrate that, in fact, it's not about pushing the pain onto certain actors or certain sectors. Like, for example, the cement sector is one of the most difficult sectors to decarbonize. It will probably be the most expensive, but we also need cement. So, you know, we have to, the message that we're delivering to those sectors is not stop doing what you're doing. It's we are going to jointly invest in this transition. Policy is going to push in the right direction so that markets ultimately deliver the products and services that get us to our carbon ceilings. That means keeping some people in business. It will mean pushing some people out of business, but hopefully we have an enterprise policy that is agile enough that the economy as a whole and our enterprise base is resilient enough to the transition so that we're not suffering shocks or employment shocks in particular sectors that we're preparing early enough. Question on aviation, you're right, it's kind of a no-win policy area for an island country, which is dependent on, you know, airplanes for a huge volume of our economic activity. Aviation is now included in ETS2, which is the new expanded ETS program. I think that EU level coordination and advice on EU level aviation carbon is going to really be the policy driver in Ireland. I don't see, except maybe a subsidy on sustainable aviation fuel or some, you know, that kind of incentive. I don't see a fundamentally different approach being taken domestically, but it's not my policy area, so the Department of Transport can happily correct me if I said the wrong thing there. Yeah, just the last point on the carbon sinks or carbon abatements from our environment. I completely agree that's an underexplored area. You know, the rewetting of our peatlands is always held up as a really, you know, quite a significant potential carbon sink. There's a land use review ongoing. There will be a carbon budget for land use change and forestry, which will essentially try and mobilize some of that activity. But you're right, it is the forgotten cousin of, you know, stick a solar panel on a roof and stick a heat pump instead of a boiler. Like we do have to take a more holistic view, and you know, there's obviously biodiversity co-benefits to addressing that too. So I accept the criticism that it's not a key part of the picture now, but I think that will change in time, especially as we get to net zero. You know, that final bit of trajectory only works when you're maximizing your land use and maximizing your nature to act as a carbon sink to offset the residual emissions. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully Yvonne can answer the really tough ones.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe and Barra, for covering a lot of the ground, and thanks to everyone for the questions, both in the room and online. So let me just jump through them very quickly in terms of what's left. I'll just go them take them in the order that they came. So firstly, to Paul Sweeney online, in terms of the, you know, whether the central bank should be proactively incentivizing green lending, if we're to put it that way. What I would say is, and again, it's I guess it's my own personal opinion that I'm speaking about here, but there is this issue isn't being ignored, shall we say, from a kind of central banking or regulatory perspective. The first thing to say is that within a European context, the European Banking Authority, to which we obviously contribute from a supervisory perspective, was actually mandated to explore this precise issue. So should there be incentives actually put in place from whatever, you know, should there be risk, should there be prudential a differential prudential treatment for green versus non-green activities, let's say, should banks be encouraged to lend more green? And there was a report that they published last May, and they with a discussion paper, which was step one in this process, which I would encourage you to take a look at, Paul, if you're particularly interested in the space. And there was lots of submissions, I suppose, to that discussion paper, and there is a further report to come in due course. So the jury is still out, shall we say. It's not yet, the decision is not yet fully made. But I suppose the point that comes out of that discussion paper is very much that there's still a lot of unknowns. And I suppose what's really important is that we know that from an EU policymaking perspective and an Irish policymaking perspective, we do want to support transition, but from a financial perspective, what's really important is that the prudential and the framework is set up in a way that we support transition, but being cognizant of the risks involved. So we can't ignore the fact that we need to understand the risks attached to be the green investments or non-green investments better than we currently do. And my own personal sense is that the treatment of green should be based on the risks attached therein. So if we can show that green activities are truly less risky, then sure, you can see that there is a positive story to be told there around incentives to, reduce capital requirements for banks, for example, that are lending green. But you really need to have that information, and that information is not yet there. We're still exploring it. So my view is that we need to keep in mind our central mandate, which is to ensure a stability of the financial system and of the firms within it, because if we don't ensure that, then the financial system isn't going to be capable of doing what it needs to do, be that from a green perspective or anything else. And in that context, we can't ignore the risks attached to whatever types of activities are to happen, whether they be green or not. So in the green space, the European Banking Authority report is particularly interesting. They do have this mandate to make a decision on this particular issue, but the work continues, and certainly for now, there will be a decision. There will be another report coming on that in due course. I think by 2024, 2025. I can't remember the precise deadline, but so we continue to explore that issue and work on it. Tara, I think Barra covered your point off well in terms of political instability, but again, it's just to reiterate the same point that climate transition internationally, at all the COPs and the like, a big issue that comes up is a just transition. So within a given country, there can be political instability, of course, because some policy to promote transition might be less favorable to some groups than to others. And I think Barra covered that point off very well in terms of, when you are raising revenues from climate policies, you have to be careful about what you do with those revenues to make that a just transition within your own country in terms of distributional implications. But that's also true internationally, and it's a huge issue. There is obviously one of the bigger issues that's more around the fact that what are the expectations of developing countries versus developed countries, and global geopolitical stability. That's a big issue that's been raised in that context. And I suppose one of the big developments last year at COP was this agreement for there to be this fund to support developing countries. I think it's in the range of about 100 billion. Billion, yes. Thank you. To basically support developing countries who haven't benefited from the same economic development and the carbon intensity that goes with that as developed countries have. There's quite a way to still go in putting together that fund, but certainly that is another issue. It's not just about political stability, it's also about geopolitical stability. And again, I think that is something we must never lose sight of. And it certainly is very high on the international stage, I think, in terms of that just transition point. Martina, when you talk about green versus non-green, and is it all about green, and what about I suppose the transitional activities or the kind of gradual convergence? I think that's a really important point, and it's something that people don't often pick up on as well when we talk about the likes of the EU taxonomy. So the EU taxonomy, I know Joe talked about it earlier on, is essentially, it's a list of economic activities that are defined according to how green they are or not. So you're either on the list or as a green activity or you're not. So it's sometimes called the green taxonomy. So it essentially goes through in a very refined detail all the various economic activities that it has accomplished or gone through to date. And if they're green, it says so, and it kind of explains why and the like. But it is also a live document, and it's also, the EU Commission hasn't gone through every single economic activity. it hasn't gone through in a very refined detail every single thing that can happen in a given country and that can contribute to economic activity. So it's not finished, shall we say, it's always going to be live. So more things can be added to that list to be green over time. But it also allows for transitional activities. So the likes of, you'll all be aware of the kind of nuclear and gas debate that went on. And nuclear and gas are now in the EU taxonomy because they're considered to be those supporting kind of transitional activities. And there's also, it's quite technical, the EU taxonomy. So, there is a process whereby an entity or an individual can apply for activities to be considered deemed green that aren't already deemed green. There's a process, there's a feedback process there that can happen as well. So I think, like, in an EU context, there's still lots of work to be done. And it's not just about green, it's also about, like, this year the EU Commission is working on social taxonomy, because when we talk about green, and we talk about ESG, it's not just about green, which is environmental, it's also about social and governance. So there's a lot of ongoing work that needs to be considered and that is still happening there. But I think, and of course it's different in the global setting, like what's green in Europe may not be precisely green somewhere else. So that's also an issue that needs to be worked out a little bit more. And that comes to your second point, which is kind of around, is there a danger that we're pushing, I suppose, some of the environmentally damaging activities outside of Europe, or, if I picked your point up correctly there. And I think that's precisely why the EU worked on the CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is essentially like a taxation for, so if we stop doing certain activities that are particularly harmful, let's say in Europe, because we want to reduce our emissions, but then we start importing things from outside Europe that are particularly harmful in another country, there's a kind of an injustice there, isn't there, in there, and a lack of equality, shall we say, that our emissions in Europe are reducing because we've gotten rid of something, but we're still importing and benefiting from a consumption perspective. And that's why CBAM was kind of brought, or one of the reasons CBAM came into the fold, which was that we needed to tax those activities when they come back into Europe, to prevent that transfer of environmental damage to other countries. But of course, that debate continues. It's not just on the taxation front, it's also on the subsidy front, because of course in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has introduced subsidies for green investments and technology advancement and the like. And now we have the kind of, the reciprocity of that in the European context still under a lot of work still happening in that space too. So it's not just about the damaging piece, it's also about the, like, where does green technology advancement take place, and how do you encourage that, and how do you ensure that that's done in an equal way? So I think that's another ongoing interesting topic to keep an eye on. Chris, to your point, what should Ireland be investing in? I'm not sure I have I can't say exactly what Ireland should be investing in, but I think what's really important from a financial system perspective is that what we do know is that the risk of brown activities being priced is not being adequately priced in right now. So we know for certain that when you look at the prices across the globe, or even locally, or even within Europe, of very damaging things versus not damaging things, the price differentials aren't that large. And ultimately, price is a signal. So people need price differentials to exist to kind of inform them as to, like, where they should be going. And that's part of the reason the carbon taxation works as well. And I know Joe raised that, and Barra talked about it also, is that, carbon taxation adjusts the price. So it's a signaling device as well as other things. So I think what we know right now is that the price differential, the risk to reflect the underlying risk of brown versus green is not quite there yet. And from a financial system perspective, what I would really like to see is that, that becomes better over time. And that helps then to guide investment to the right activities. Now, what's really encouraging here is that, the kind of things that we touched on earlier on around disclosure requirements, for example. So all corporates, large corporates of particular size, doing particular types of things, are going to now have to start disclosing to the world, how climate friendly they are in terms of their activities and other things. And equally in the financial sector, there's quite, onerous disclosure requirements in place or coming for financial providers, financial firms as well. So I think that the more disclosures about how much climate exposure you have as a firm that come out, the more data that becomes available, the more that consumers and investors and the like can access that information. That should really help to contribute to the, the pricing issue and the risk differential perspective. So I think that's very positive. And I think that that signal is what we need for the investment to go to those right places. And the final thing that I have here, my list, Michael, I hope I haven't missed anyone, apologies if I have, is around carbon absorption versus like carbon reduction. Again, a very valid point. And when we talk about the investment needs, those kind of figures that I talked about earlier on, and you might also recall that chart I put up where I showed the very large gap between where we need to go in Ireland to get to what we call net zero by 2050 versus where we can get to with government policy alone. A lot of the assumptions underlying that is that technology will evolve in a way that carbon capture becomes much more significant over time. And you rightly pointed things like green gardens or trees, and they are the most natural carbon capture device that we have. And that's why, again, at COP, a lot of the discussions emerge around deforestation and the costs of that. And there's lots of innovative kind of financial things happening, and the World Bank is very focused on this, as well as other international organizations, around how do you prevent deforestation and the like. But even aside from that, there needs to be a lot more technology development for us to be able to get to where we need to go in terms of carbon capture. And that's where we're kind of hanging our hat, to be perfectly honest, in some sense, to kind of over time be able to do what we need to do. But that's everything I have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So sorry for going over time. That's absolutely my fault. We plan to have coffee, which is like the climate action plan. Implementation is everything. And so unfortunately, so we owe you a copy or something stronger the next time you come. That's the way. Well, thanks very much to the speakers. Before Ciara says some words, I particularly think, like, a lot of economists in this room and people outside will be looking at it saying it's your tax policies and your industrial policies and your financial markets that have created this problem. So it's great to kind of see that, yes, there's going to be turbulence and a lot of disruption in this transition, but actually tax reform, the monetary system, industrial policies, all of these things, and labor market policies, they can actually help us make these transformations and a kind of a smoother transition, so we owe that to the world, I guess, that we put those instruments into place. But really excellent talks. I really enjoyed it. So I think you have.
So just one or two things. Any comments that you'd like to be recorded in the journal, please submit them to secretary@sisi.ie. There's a couple of hard copies of volume 50 and 51 journals there. So if you haven't received one or got one, please feel free to take one. Also, it would be great if we could have some volunteers to act as a point of contact between SSISI and the institution, just so that we can liaise with you on, upcoming meetings or organising nominations for parenting prizes, etc. And so if you would like to volunteer, we would be very grateful, and you can send your details to secretary@sisi.ie. And then finally, the next meeting will be on May 25th, so look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. For staying with us.